letting the room, we're just letting the room fill up, and I will get started in just a moment. Okay, I think we can get started now. Good evening, my name is Christine Schmidt, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research here at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. On behalf of the library, I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, and especially delighted to warmly welcome Dr. Elizabeth Anthony, who will be in conversation with Professor Jacqueline Vansant. Tonight's talk will focus on Dr. Anthony's new book, The Compromise of Return, Viennese Jews After the Holocaust, which explores the motivations and expectations that inspired Viennese Jews to reestablish lives in their hometown after the devastation and trauma of the Holocaust. Dr. Anthony investigates their personal, political, and professional endeavors, revealing the contours of their experiences of returning to a post-Nazi society, with full awareness that most of their fellow Austrians had embraced the Nazi takeover and their country's unification with Germany, clinging to a collective national identity myth as first victims of the Nazis. The book presents a masterful weaving together of archival documentation with oral histories, interviews, memoir, and personal correspondence to craft a multi-layered, multi-voiced narrative of return focused on the immediate post-war years. The Compromise of Return is the first such social history to depict how survivors, individually and collectively, navigated post-war Vienna's political and social setting. Now, before I introduce our speakers, just a few notes of housekeeping. You'll be kept on mute throughout the formal conversation, but we'll save time at the end to take some questions from the audience. And of course, we'll try to get to as many as possible, but apologies if we can't fit all of your questions in. So please feel free to type your comments or questions into the chat at any time, and I will try to feed these back to our speakers. We are also recording tonight's session, but your camera will not appear on screen. We are using automated captioning for those who might need it, but please note that this is automated, and so it does not always accurately reflect what the speakers are saying. It will be corrected for the YouTube version of this video. And finally, if you have any technical issues, please send me or my colleague Martina a direct message, and we'll try to help. So now on to our speakers. Elizabeth Anthony is a historian and serves as the Director of Visiting Scholar Programs at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She received her PhD in history from Clark University and was co-editor of Freilegungen, the fourth volume of the ITS yearbook series, with Rebecca Böhling, Susanna Urban, and Suzanne Brown-Fleming. I know Elizabeth Anthony as Betsy, so I hope she'll be okay with me switching to a more familiar form of address. And I'm so pleased and honored to host this book talk for such a wonderful scholar, a dear friend, and a fellow Clarkie. And I'm so very proud of this accomplishment. She will be led in conversation by Jacqueline Vansant, who is Professor Emerita of German at the University of Michigan Dearborn. Her work has focused on the construction of ethnicities, gender, and national identities in post-World War II and contemporary Austrian literature, memoirs, and films. She has published Austria Made in Hollywood in 2019, Reclaiming Heimat, Trauma and Mourning in Memoirs by Jewish Austrian Re-emigres in 2001, and a number of other books and articles. Among many other accolades, she was awarded the University of Michigan Dearborn's Distinguished Research Award in 2017. And I will also, if she doesn't mind, revert to calling Professor Vansant Jackie, as I now know her. And I've known Jackie even longer than I've known Betsy, actually, as she was my former professor of German at UMD many moons ago. So it is now with both personal and professional delight that I hand the virtual floor over now to Jackie so she can begin tonight's conversation.
Well, thank you, Christine. You stole my words because I wanted to say that this is both a personal and professional pleasure for me. Betsy's book was so exciting to read, and Betsy, you really bring history alive. You paint a vivid picture of life of Jewish Austrians who, after the fall of the Nazi regime, remained in or returned to Vienna. And as Christine said, through personal interviews, coupled with meticulous archival research and in conversation with international scholarship, you convincingly argue that their unique Jewish Viennese identities allowed them to remain in an anti-Semitic society that presented itself so long as as Hitler's first victim. The compromise of return constitutes a major contribution to post-war Austrian and Holocaust histories. And I want to jump in with a couple questions that will set the historical context for us. So could you provide a short overview of the historical context on the position of Austria's Jewish population before 1938, particularly vis-a-vis the monarchy?
Sure, although I do want to take a minute to have my own personal gratitude and thanks to Christine and to Jackie. As Christine said, we're old friends, we're Clarkey sisters, Clarkey siblings, and Jackie, you're a newer friend, but your work and your book, as you saw, meant everything to my work. So I really appreciate you in many different ways, and appreciate everyone here with us tonight. So thank you all very much. So to move on to a context of the Jewish population in Austria before 1938. Well, Jews had lived in Austria for centuries. Settlement restrictions were lifted after 1848. Jews from the outer reaches of the empire then started to migrate to Vienna with the Ausgleich in 1867 and full emancipation in the empire, even more such migration from these other parts of the empire of Jewish migrants to Vienna. There was, of course, anti-Semitism nonetheless at this time, late 19th century, 20th. Nationalism is this growing issue across the Habsburg lands, and with it, of course, anti-Semitism. Jews are blamed for things like the May 1873 stock market crash. Anti-Semitism becomes a part of political platforms. But despite the anti-Semitism pervasively found in Vienna, Jews found their way there to maneuver. They were integrated into society. Many enjoyed great success. Some converted, though maybe not as many as commonly assumed or understood. But in any case, there's a great deal of integration and acculturation in a relatively short time. They were thoroughly Viennese, which I think is important, and you mentioned is a big part of what I write about. The fact that they were thoroughly Viennese, that they identified as Viennese, was a way that they could return to Vienna and navigate post-war Vienna because they had the confidence to do so, and the idea that they could return. There's always been some ambiguity to Austrian identity. One could feel both Austrian and German and still be a loyal monarchist. Others felt the same way, but favored Anschluss. And similarly, Jews could be 100% Viennese, but also feel Austrian, German, and Jewish at the same time. Jews supported and fought in World War I as loyal Austrians. Tens of thousands of Jewish refugees fled the Russians to Vienna, where the Jewish community and the Austrian state supported them. But of course, this influx of Eastern Jews meant more anti-Semitism. With the end of World War I and the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, nationalism in these new nation states and meant that Jews and other minorities suffered. It was believed, commonly understood, that Jews could not have a national loyalty. Jews in Austria had hoped that, they hoped that they would be able to identify as both Austrians and as Jews. But of course, at this point, they weren't able to feel or be accepted as quote unquote German. And most Austrian Jews grieved the end of the monarchy. By 1934, the Jewish population of Vienna totaled a little over 176,000. I won't go into a full-blown Austrian history lesson, but leading up to the Nazis, there was an Austro-fascist regime in Austria. There's a short civil war in 1934, lots of turmoil, fighting. The Nazi Party was illegal. Ultimately, the Social Democrats were made illegal as well. But the Austro-fascists essentially kept the Nazis at bay for a time. Schuschnigg was the chancellor at the time of the Anschluss, and just before he worked to try to prevent it. Of course, that was unsuccessful. Schuschnigg resigned on March 11th, and then the following day, March 12th, 1938, we have the Anschluss. One thing that I do think is interesting to point out, and now I do wish I had a PowerPoint, I'm sorry, I left this as a discussion rather than having pictures. But I think that images that are kind of emblematic of the persecution of Jews in Vienna, with which many of us, most of us are probably familiar, are photographs of Jews who are being forced to scrub the pavement in Vienna. And this has something to do with what I was just saying about Schuschnigg and these last moments. Obviously, having to scrub the pavement with a toothbrush or another small brush is an act of humiliation, but there's even a little more to it. Just before the Anschluss, obviously before his resignation, Schuschnigg had made a last-minute attempt at a referendum on Austrian independence. And there were political slogans and graffiti all over the streets. And it's that graffiti that Jews in those photos are being forced to scrub. So it's humiliating to scrub the streets. It's persecution to scrub the streets, but there's also this added layer of kind of rubbing their faces in what it was they were forced to scrub away. And I just think it's an interesting point of context that isn't too often mentioned.
Yeah. And plus the onlookers as they had to do it. Yeah. So you mentioned the figure 176,000 Jews in Vienna. So how many were able to flee? How many were murdered? And what percentage did 176,000 represent?
So 176 is a figure, 176,000 is a figure from 1934.
Okay.
At the time of the Anschluss in Austria, it's estimated about 201,000 Jews, and that is including Nazi-defined, so-called, Nuremberg-defined Jews. The Viennese Jewish community had a formal membership of about 185,000 members, but if you incorporate all these other people who were subject to persecution as Jews, we're talking a little over 200,000. About 2/3 of them were able to escape, not all to safety, but most, and of course about 65,000 of them were murdered by the Nazis. After the Anschluss, the Nazis reorganized the Jewish community to do this dirty work of forced emigration. The initial program for the first couple of years was to force Jews out, and of course, force them out after they've been robbed and persecuted, and some had been sent to concentration camps and things like that. But forced emigration was the program at that point. And Viennese Jews fled all over the world, from Shanghai to the UK, North America, Palestine, Latin America, all over the world. Vienna was also the place where Adolf Eichmann first made his name, where he and his men put the Jewish community to work to enact this forced emigration. Ultimately, thought to be, intended to be, and to a certain extent was a model used throughout Greater Germany. And the practice of commandeering the Jewish community leadership to carry out the regime's intended dirty work evolved also into establishment of Judenräte, the Jewish councils in ghettos in the East. The distinctive thing about Austrian Jews' experience, what had developed in Germany over the course of 5 years happened overnight in Austria. The Anschluss was in March 38. The November pogrom, the so-called Kristallnacht, was in November 1938, one could say that the November pogrom began in March in Vienna. So this violence and persecution characterized what happened to Viennese Jews immediately and swiftly. But to get as specific as possible, of the 201,000 Jews in Austria at the time of the Anschluss, about 135,000 were able to flee and 65,000 murdered.
And we know that very few returned after 1945. And now my next question is a bit more involved. Actually, it's sort of a set of questions. So who did return and why? What was the timeline? And what material and psychological challenges faced those returning?
Okay. So in May 1945, about 5,600 had survived in the city. Some were hiding, actually in concealment. Some were employees of the Jewish community. Others were protected in mixed marriages or were the children of such marriages that provided some level of protection for people. So 5,600 survived in the city. By the end of 1945, more than 800 camp survivors had joined them, and about 140 from abroad. And you can take a look at, although numbers are tricky, as we can already see, looking at the formal membership of the Jewish community can give you an idea of the rate of return. If at the end of 45, there were, I don't know, about, I'm doing the math, at about a little over 6,000. By the end of 1946, there were almost 6,500 formal members, and by the end of 47, almost 8,800. So when I initially started this research and started this project, I was really thinking in terms of camp returnees and those coming back from abroad. And I realized that returnees from abroad came back for two different, although sometimes overlapping reasons. Most from abroad came back for political or professional reasons. But also, as I dug into the research, I realized about these 5,600 people who had survived in the city. And I realized that that was the first group of returnees, those who never left the city. I had to treat them as the first wave to, I'd say, reemerge into society immediately with the Soviet conquest of Vienna. And so the first returnees were those who survived in the city. They immediately, returned into society from which they'd been thrust, and immediately looked for family in the city and to take care of their basic needs. So that's the first wave. They're coming back for family reasons, reemerging with those motivations. Within a few weeks, camp survivors started to return really by any means possible, some on foot, by bicycle, hitching rides, however they could. They were also looking for family in the last place they had it, where else to go. And so it's these two groups, these very, very first groups that come back, I refer to as returning, I refer to it as their family home. Their motivation was their family home. The next to come back from abroad were those from abroad. And specifically, the first sort of wave from abroad came for political reasons. Social Democrats and communists who'd been with their parties abroad came back, and they came back with the intention and motivation to reclaim their Austria, to rebuild an autonomous democratic Austria. This was their political home, and they felt, they believed, and their parties told them that Austria and Austrians expected them and would welcome them back. They were quickly disabused of such idealistic notions very, very soon after their return, but nonetheless, most of them stayed. And they began, these exile returnees from abroad who came back for political reasons, began to return later in 1945 and through 1946. The next wave, so if the first wave comes for familial home, the second wave comes for political home, the third wave, really fourth, comes for professional home. These are people who were mostly living in exile abroad, who felt bound to Austria, to Vienna, by their training, maybe as doctors or lawyers. They, as you know, well, Jackie, some of them felt bound by the language, and they were writers and authors and journalists who wanted to work in the language that they wanted to work. And many of them had a difficult time gaining a foothold abroad, a difficult time getting to the level to which they were accustomed, either professionally, maybe socially. And many chose to go back and knowingly made the decision that they would rather live next door to former Nazis than live or work at a lesser level. One man I read about was a successful lawyer in Vienna, and he fled to Palestine, and the only thing that he could do while there was pick oranges. And he made the decision that he would rather take his chances living next door to maybe former Nazis in Vienna than the difficult manual labor in an orange grove. So it's just an extreme example, but an example of these people who came back for professional reasons a little bit after these political returnees, starting later in 1946 and into 1947. And I mean, of course, there was overlap between the groups. For example, when a train full of returnees from Shanghai, Viennese Jews who had spent their time in exile in Shanghai, when they came back in 1947, many were coming back for a family home, but it seems a little bit later in the wave structure that I've put out. But of course, there were many other motivations for people among them as well. So this is sort of a rough kind of wave structure that I noticed in the research.
Yeah. Well, and after, when returning, sort of how did they then negotiate this sort of terrain and the opposition for them being there? I mean,
right. Yeah. I mean, you'd asked about some challenges, material and psychological and otherwise. I mean, first of all, physically, they arrived back to a city that's 25%, maybe close to a third bombed out. There's housing shortages, there's food shortages, and their arrival back in the city is seen as competition for these things. Gentile Austrians who had benefited from so-called Aryanization feared that Jews wanted their property and their businesses back. They'd want their homes back. So they confronted the infrastructure, an infrastructure that was destroyed and that for which everyone was, competing. They confronted the fear that Gentile Austrians had about their return and what that might mean. And of course, anti-Semitism remained, that Germans were gone, but not necessarily the Nazis, nor the Nazi sentiment. One of the survivors I interviewed said when he came back, he knew it was there, but it had gone subterranean. That's his phrase. Sometimes, certainly a challenge was to hear some of the anti-Semitic thoughts or comments that might happen. One survivor said that he heard someone refer to the good old days when they had the Jews to clear the streets of snow. But overall, more or less, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, they were confronted with sort of an understood silence, kind of maybe a don't ask, don't tell type policy and attitude towards what had happened during the war by both sides. But I think, I'll get into that in a little bit. One survivor, Hansi Tausig, who's if you see the book, you can tell I fell in love with her. She's just a wonderful person, and I wrote a lot about her. She told me a story that has something to do with both their dashed, idealistic dreams and the problems that of the infrastructure and the material problems. When she was in London, she had fled to London and had been involved with the Austrian Communist Party abroad and their youth group arm, Young Austria. They'd conducted a book drive. They'd gone around to different homes in London, knocking on doors of Jewish, German Jewish and Austrian Jewish refugees who might have books that they could collect to take back to replenish libraries in Austria. The youth group saw their mission as rehabilitation and to fix the educational system. And they worked very, very hard. They had a number of doors slammed in their faces. Of course, there were many German and Austrian Jews who did not have any interest in helping or rehabilitating Germany or Austria. But they collected all these books nonetheless. They packed them up and they sent them back to Vienna. On her first night back in town, when she and her husband arrived, they spent the night in the Communist Party offices in Vienna. And there she came upon this huge garbage heap in a back room that, upon closer inspection, she saw was all of these books that they had very carefully collected. They were all moldy and wet and just absolutely ruined, could not be used. And she said, well, yeah, we were idealistic. What were we thinking? We come back to this city, people don't have a place to live. They don't have food. They're not worried about books. So it summed up that stark reality that really hit her in the face. But also, as she said too, it was also symbolic of their idealistic intentions and motivations and expectations being thrown on a figurative and actual garbage heap. This is obviously has to do with material challenges, also psychological ones that they had to overcome. I think one of the biggest and the most important context for problems and challenges associated with return would be the post-war victim myth, the post-war national, developing a national identity that took on, really embraced the idea of victim, and that is Hitler's first victim, as designated in the Moscow Declaration in 1943. The Allies laid out plans for how different countries in Europe would be dealt with after they won the war. And with reference to Austria, it referred to Austria as the first free country to fall to Hitler aggression, referred to its liberation. This victim myth was rooted in that and became, in many ways, guiding a lot of foreign and some domestic policy. And it was this that the post-war government really, grabbed onto and kept that. And from the top of, to the bottom, people accepted this. This was something that returning Jews had to deal with. This idea that all these people that they knew, the neighbors and others that they knew, had been active supporters or involved or at least stood by, were now assuming this idea that they were victims. And part of that came out in a denial of any bad experience they could have had if they're not really talking about it, and then assuming things like, well, actually the only reference would be something like, you're so lucky you weren't here. It was so bad, the bombings, it was terrible. Or one survivor said, she was greeted with, why did you come back? It just must have been so much better wherever you were in a concentration camp. I mean, there was no discussion about where people had been or what people had done from either side. And every once in a while, there's an acknowledgement. One woman said when she returned to her former home, a neighbor said, "Oh, you're still alive?" And then quickly corrected and went back to the, "Oh, you're so lucky that you weren't here. Let me tell you about these bombings and things." So these were the kinds of things that they had to hear. They had to deal with this silence, this sort of understood, don't ask, don't tell, and you don't have to know, and could make it more comfortable to live. And people did live pretty well. They also, one thing that was kind of interesting too is noting that the Austrian desire to be not German was so specific. I think George Clare wrote about the prevalence of Viennese dialect after the war that he never ever noticed before, right? That suddenly their German wasn't going to sound German. People were wearing Tyrolean hats in Vienna, which is incongruous, and there was just this, but a symbol of this Austrian patriotism and something that's really not German. So, yeah, I think that a very, very important element of the returnees' motivations and expectations, things that could help them with, overcoming these kinds of challenges, really goes back to what I mentioned before about a very distinct concept of their own Viennese identity and the confidence that they could, return to a place where they knew anti-Semitism might be pervasive, but that they also knew how to navigate. And Matti Bunzel, sociologist, says that Vienna could be for them, it could be music and art and culture and opera. Austria, Holocaust, Hitler, nowadays right-wing government, there was a way to really identify with Vienna and the real positives. Survivors I talked to would say different forms of, "I love Vienna. The Austrians, or I could do without," or something like that. So there definitely seems to be a distinction made, and that identification with Vienna is just really important and guiding.
So you mentioned silence, and I want to jump to the topic of language, which is also an important, plays an important role in your writing. I mean, you write, for example, about the use of language by National Socialists, how Austrians who did not immigrate talk about the years, and you mentioned that, and also your own language choices. Could you elaborate on any one of these? I mean, jump in where you want on the role of language for you when you were writing.
Sure. I mean, in many ways, this also has to do with the victim myth, both the choice of language used in Austria over decades after the war, and then my own choice of what to use and how to write. So, an example would be, I chose not to use, I absolutely disagree with, and I will not use the word occupation to refer to the Nazis in Vienna, nor would I say that the Red Army liberated Vienna. These are phrases that and terms that have been used for years, and you can still see sometimes here. I'm in Vienna at the moment, so when I say here, sorry. The Anschluss was not the aggressive invasion the government wanted to sort of paint this picture, and to which they referred, and it wasn't a military occupation by the Germans. You can even hear sometimes, it's been a while since I've heard this, but you can even hear a reference to 17 years of occupation, and thus the victimization of 7 years of Nazi occupation and then 10 years of Allied occupation. I made a choice not to use Nazi language, or at least not without indication. I choose to use November Pogrom instead of Kristallnacht. If I am referring to so-called Mischlinge, I'll say, or so-called, or use quotation marks around Aryanization. Terms that were really Nazi terms, I wanted to offset and not sort of perpetuate. But other issues of language, and also to what you refer, there's a specific, I write a lot about the Segasa 9 camp returnee home, as it referred to itself as a Katze-Rückkehrheim. The US Army called it a DP camp. This was really important, and it was very helpful for that little home, that returnee home, because then they got different kinds of benefits and help through the US Army and also the Joint, of course. And so this example of language was really, really crucial for how these people who were largely not DPs, if displaced persons are displaced outside of their country. I mean, these were largely Viennese Jews living in this returnee home. And so that's another issue of sort of creative terminology that was helpful. Yeah, and then of course these comments that I just referred to about, oh, you're so lucky you weren't here, the bombings, and this use of such language and phrasing that silences, that actually causes the silence to happen. So language is so important, and I tried to take it really seriously as well.
So how did you get interested in this project?
So I have a longer history at the Holocaust Museum. I am currently working in the Mandel Center, as Christine mentioned, but I worked for a number of years in the museum's Office of Survivor Affairs, at late 1990s, early 2000s, and worked with families, survivors and their families on behalf of the museum. In 2004, I moved to Vienna and became involved a bit in the Jewish community. And in particular, I volunteered at the Jewish nursing home in Vienna. I was supposed to practice my German. A good friend of mine is the psychologist at the Maimonides Zentrum, the Jewish nursing home here. And what happened was, on the very first day I walked in and they heard my accent, and they all wanted to speak English with me, because where did most Viennese Jews go? To English-speaking places, to the UK, to the United States, to Palestine. So they never spoke a word of German with me. It turned into a weekly English tish, and I got to know a lot of Viennese returnees in this way. So this kind of led me to my focus. All my work prior to moving to Vienna was with survivors and their families, but they were in the United States. So obviously they had emigrated. They did not go back to their hometowns, or at least they hadn't stayed there. And I know that I had known intellectually that some German Jews, Austrian Jews, Polish Jews even went home, but I don't know that I had really fully realized it, maybe, I don't know, on an emotional level, or accepted it, until I was there and meeting these elderly Viennese Jews. And so that's how the idea sort of developed, but it crystallized when I went back to the United States to visit my family and friends, but I went to the survivor group at the museum, which I had run. We had a monthly survivor meeting, and they asked me, oh, Betsy, stand up and tell us what you've been doing in Vienna. And when I stood up and said, among other things, that I was volunteering at the Jewish nursing home, they were absolutely fascinated. You could have heard a pin drop. And they had so many questions, because they didn't quite realize that there were Jews in Vienna. They must have known it intellectually too, but they didn't quite realize. Some of them were not happy. Some of them were angry, said they're bad Jews and they shouldn't be there. But most of them were just really, really interested. And so when I saw the mixed feelings they had about this, and also that they didn't know much about it, I thought, okay, I think there's a question here, and there's a project here, and it evolved into what you see now.
Well, I have one last question, a plug that I sort of have to put in as a language teacher. So returning to the topic of language. So how important in your research was it that you are fluent in German? Because I'm assuming that you did then have an opportunity outside of the that activity just to develop your German.
I did. Yes, I couldn't rely on them. I realized, but and they told me often, because most of them were from the UK, that their English was better than mine. German was essential, and even more specifically, some familiarity with Austrian Wienerisch and Austrian phrasing and terms. Most of, I mean, really, your book is one of the only ones really written very focused on Austria that is in English. Thank you. But as far as reading, accessing the oral histories, there's fantastic collections. Albert Lichtblau has done amazing interviews with survivors here in Austria, all over Austria, and a 100% in German. So just being able to listen, to read, and then to interact with survivors. My German's not beautiful, but es funktioniert. And I think that it helped a little bit. The survivors thought it was sweet. I interviewed a couple of people that didn't speak English, so I had to do it. It was really essential, but I think it also helped to make relationships and get closer to people.
Well, thank you, Betsy. And I will turn this back over to Christine.
Thank you both for a very interesting and fascinating, well, it's basically just a glimpse of Betsy's study. And so I hope you will. I'll actually put a link in the chat to where you can purchase her book in just a few minutes. But I wanted to actually turn to questions from the audience. We've got about 15 minutes. So if you have a question or a comment for Betsy, please feel free to put it in the chat and I will feed them back to her. We have one question already from Anna. Anna says she's a fan of your book and it's a treat to listen to this conversation, which I absolutely agree. Could you tell us how you see your book in the context of post-war European Jewish history? On whom do you build? With whom do you disagree? What do you think are the key new statements of your book? And also, do you think post-war Austria is Western Europe?
Thank you. I mean, I think that, I mean, first of all, there's just not a whole lot that really focuses on return and returnees and that part of history. It fits into, you know, if in the last 20 years we've been spending more time and attention on post-war histories, DPs, things like that, there's just not that much. And so I hope that my book fits along with Dinke Hundius's book about return in the Netherlands. Surely, hopefully it fits happily next to Jackie's on people's bookshelves. And then there are a couple of Austrian published books, Helge Embacher, and you know, that I hope that, again, you know, I'm adding to that and helping to round out. I think that I try to talk about these post-war motivations, these post-war decisions that survivors made in terms of Viennese identity and how clearly defined that was and how important that was. And I think that adds to the discussion, but also is new and not mentioned quite that same way when talking about returnees. It goes along with Jackie's work and really kind of like complements and I think works together. So I think I lost track of other threads there, but maybe that's enough for that for now. And Anna and I can talk later, but
great. There's actually a bunch more questions now coming in. Dan is congratulating you on the book, and following Anna's question, he'd like to ask you whether you see anything unique to post-war Vienna in comparison to other locations, insofar that, you know, if you've situated the study within, you know, kind of an understanding of other post-war contexts.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, the context of this sort of really already rooted victim identity, national identity in Austria made it so that if victim myths abounded in post-war Europe in different countries in different forms, and they did, the idea of this absolute national view of Austria as victim made it a very different context to be in actually a perpetrator country that is assuming the role as victim. So I think that certainly makes it very unique. But I also think that, I mean, this, it's another book, but this very clearly defined and guiding Viennese aspect to returnees' identity is unique. And I have to say, I also see it as something unique among not even those who did not return. The Viennese survivors that I know who are Americans now and US citizens for decades have a very special connection to Vienna, one that I, in my work with other survivors, don't see among German Jewish survivors, and definitely not among Polish survivors. And I can't generalize and say every single one, but I really do think that there's something very unique about that identification with the city that's unique. I mean, the survivors would talk about Vienna like a person, like a family member, like, they almost were giving it human qualities when they spoke of it and their love for it. So I think I've threatened for 10 or 15 years that could be my next project, that I'll work on the attitudes of Viennese Jews abroad too. Who knows?
You just preempted one of my questions I was going to ask you, what you're working on next. But let's get back to the questions in the chat. Paul's asking, saying that his grandfather was one of the returnees, and he returned in 1947 from Philadelphia. So he's just curious why you reject the term liberation. Could you elaborate on that?
I reject the term liberation of Austria for, maybe I should have been clear. When I was saying I don't use that term, it's in reference to the country being liberated from the Nazis, and that Gentile Austrians also saw themselves as being liberated from the Nazis, or they wanted to. Certainly, when the Red Army showed up in Vienna and those 5,600 Jews who'd survived, some of them in hiding, some of them in mixed marriages, they were liberated. I would use it in reference to them, but not the way that France was liberated, or something like that. So that's more what I meant specifically about that term.
Thank you. Another question from Noah. You mentioned DP camps. There were various, obviously, as you know, various DP camps in Vienna and Austria in the immediate post-war, for example, at the Rothschild Hospital. How, if at all, did Viennese Jews interact with Jewish DPs survivors from other countries?
Yeah, and certainly there was the Rothschild Spital was a very big DP camp, and also the this little Degasse, this little nursing home turned camp returnee home I mentioned a bit ago, was also an opportunity. I mean, in that particular case, as I said, they were Viennese. So you're right, of course, there were plenty of DPs from other countries who were in Vienna, in other parts of Austria, waiting to try to emigrate onward, and it caused problems. If Viennese were to accept back Viennese Jews, that might be one thing, but to have all the stereotypes that one might hold about East European Jews, and even amongst the Viennese Jews, the idea that the Viennese Jews and those from the East could be also very divided and see themselves as very, very different, when activities and things that were going on in and with DP camps helped to arouse anti-Semitism in post-war Vienna, post-war Austria. it was a problem for then the Viennese Jews as well, having to sort of, in some ways, differentiate themselves and pull away. There was a lot of distrust and ideas of criminality among, sort of inherent criminality among Jews by Gentile Austrians, and then particularly these seemingly foreign, very foreign Jews that were DPs.
Thank you. And another question from Victoria. Could you speak to research that's been, sorry, I lost it, that's been done into experiences of second and third generation returnees?
I can't. I don't know that I know of. I have my own experiences and my own observations. That's definitely something to be worked on.
And Dana is asking another question actually about language. She's beginning to read your book and found your comments on terminology and language interesting. And it's, again, fitting that we're having so many conversations about language, Jackie and you. But as docents at the museum in the 21st century, I'm assuming maybe this is someone from USHMM, how can we change our language when guiding visitors through the exhibition space to not perpetuate Nazi terminology?
This is a little bit inside museum terminology, but I keep talking to the people on the PE refresh. We're supposedly we're revamping the permanent exhibition, and I do believe that it's important to take apart terms like Kristallnacht and to put quotation marks around Mischling. I do believe that that's important, but I don't have the power to do it, and it's not. Well, it'll be interesting to see how it moves forward. I would love to talk to you more about it if you, in your own docenting, Jackie, want to talk about ways that terminology could be shaped a little bit.
Jackie, did you want to add? Oh, we have to unmute you.
No, I have to unmute. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge, because I remember when I was writing, even talking about Jewish, as you said, I mean, a lot of these, the people who were fled and were persecuted did not consider themselves Jewish. So it's like how coming up with the nomenclature is a challenge. And for me, it was also interesting how the Austrians who remained in Austria, and the Gentiles saw the bombing as a catastrophe, whereas like 38 sort of like they totally forgot what happened in 38. As far as how one does this in an exhibit, I'm sort of ich bin überfragt. I mean, I'm a little over questioned there, but
I don't know. I mean, I don't. Your point is good too. It's an exhibit. It's for the public, and it needs to be able to communicate what it's saying to anybody that walks through. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's why I'm not in charge of that part of the museum.
Okay. There is another question. I mean, you talked obviously about the material challenges faced by returnees. So this is a question from Danielle. She's curious about what happened to the property of Jewish families that was taken over by Gentile Austrian families, flats, businesses. Were they able to reclaim them?
This is really an interesting thing, and maybe this is another unique thing for Dan. What was interesting and different, or at least I think, Jews who came back early, those who came back from concentration camps, or who reemerged from hiding or whatever kind of protection they had in the city, could sometimes just get their stuff back, because their apartments might have been taken by a Nazi who then fled with the approaching Red Army, and their place was empty. Or one survivor talked about going back to their home, and there was somebody living in it, but the apartment downstairs was empty, so they just moved in downstairs. And, there was a copy of Mein Kampf on the night table, they threw it away and everything was, fine. And that she was giving this interview in the 80s or 90s, and she was still living in that apartment that her father and she had taken over. So one really strange quirk was that those people who came back very, very soon and could almost along less formal lines get things back, the Soviets did help to return businesses and some property to returnees, but then very quickly, once a provisional government was set up and Austria started running itself a little bit more, those things kind of turned around. And finally, when you saw the issuance of policy in 1947 and 48 that really laid out the possibilities and the guidelines for restitution, that's when things actually ground to a halt. So in those first couple of years, things happened. There were also people that the Nazi came back and wanted their apartment back, and the government gave it to them. So they weren't necessarily safe in reclaiming their things, but some did, and it just slowed down, unfortunately, with the legislation that should have supported it.
Thank you. I think that might be the last of the questions that we have from the audience. So actually, yeah, I just was going to ask you what are you working on next, and what are your plans for the next book, if you would like to elaborate?
Thank you. I'm working on not the idea that I said before. That's just an empty threat I make all the time. I'm working now on a focus on elderly Jews in Vienna. At this point, the research is pre-war, during, and after. My real interest is very much in elderly Holocaust survivors, elderly in the late 1940s. But I'm just sort of taking right now a broad look at all elderly Jews, if possible, in Vienna, and see where the research can take me, because it's also something I think Christine knows I've thought about and talked about and promised to do over the years. And so finally, life is giving me a little time to do what I intend. So
that's very good to hear. And I was just wanting to say that what's really nice about reading your book is that I can hear you in it, and I can hear the way that your past work with the museum, your studies at Clark, and personal history. It all sort of comes out in the book. So it's been really wonderful to read. And thank you so much for taking time to do this. I know it's late in Vienna, so we won't keep you too much longer. And I want to thank Jackie, who's logging in from Vermont, even though she's usually in Michigan. But it's been such a pleasure to have you both. And of course, I want to thank the audience for coming and for asking such interesting and helpful questions, and for a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you both. It really means a lot. And thanks very much to the audience.
Thank you and good evening.